Before we get to the exploration part of this series, it's necessary to take a look at the development of Spain and Portugal. And similar to many future nations in later Europe, early on there really was not a concept of Portugal and Spain. Portugal definitely formed an identity earlier than Spain because Spain was far more divided, and even today many of those divisions still persist. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, several Germanic tribes invaded Iberia. Groups such as the Suevi and the Vandals had already conquered Spain before the Visigoths entered Spain. By this time, the people living in Iberia had been worn down by the previous groups that invaded the peninsula, so the Goths had little problem taking over much of the peninsula in short order. The Visigoths also converted to Christianity, but the Visigoths only represented a tiny percentage of the inhabitants on the Iberian Peninsula. There were Celtic tribes, Jews, Iberians, pagans, and all sorts of other groups of people on the peninsula as well. A crisis arose in the early part of the 8th century, but what exactly transpired in those early years has been open to a lot of debate and a whole lot of uncertainty. The big problem is the lack of sources. The only contemporary source is the Chronicle of 754, which ends in that year. The Chronicle's compiler was an anonymous Christian chronicler, living under Arab rule in some part of Iberia. He makes no comment on the religion of the conquerors, never mentioning Islam nor making any reference to heresy or paganism. The source is seen as very reliable, although the material is somewhat vague. There are no contemporary Muslim accounts during this period. The first Muslim source is an account dating from the 9th century, and that was an Egyptian Muslim historian who wrote a work generally known as The Conquest of Egypt and North Africa and Spain. This work is considered to be one of the earliest Arabic Islamic histories to have survived to the present day. This Muslim account details the account of Julian, who we will talk about in a little bit. In any event, the events that surround Roderick and Julian are very sketchy. That is the main point I am trying to make. There is one thing, though, that is a certainty, and that is the Moors arrived early in the 8th century, and within just a decade they were able to conquer most of Iberia. And so here's the account leading up to the Moorish invasion. And again, take this with a grain of salt. So the story begins with the Visigothic king Witiza. His reign began in 694 AD. The exact date of Witiza's death and the end of his reign are sketchy. The generally accepted year of his death is 710. It's unclear exactly how he died, but it appears he could have been assassinated in a political coup led by an usurper named Roderick. In any event, Roderick, with the support of a faction of nobles, took over but was opposed by another faction of nobles that had supported Witiza. Roderick was considered an usurper by the opposing faction of nobles who supported Witiza's son. One such noble was Count Julian. It is unclear whether he was a vassal to Roderick or a Berber. In any event, as the story goes, Julian sent one of his daughters to Roderick's court for education. Roderick suddenly made her pregnant. When Julian learned of this, he was outraged and removed his daughter from Roderick's court, and out of vengeance decided to betray Roderick and his kingdom to the Muslims in North Africa. And so Julian soon visited Musa bin Nusayr, who was the Arab governor of North Africa. At this meeting, Julian told Musa of the great riches to be found in Spain. He also told Musa about the beautiful rivers and forests, and even informed him about the great palaces and treasures. According to tradition, the Muslims were also convinced they could find King Solomon's lost treasure in Spain. Musa, though, wasn't sure what to do next. Was Julian making all of this up? Was he setting up an elaborate trap? Musa decided to first ask the Caliph in Damascus for instructions. In response, the Caliph supported minor expeditions in Spain, but ordered Musa not to risk the entire Muslim army because of the unknown dangers in such a large enterprise. So Musa at first sent a minor expedition that turned out to be quite successful. Eventually, Musa grew bolder and sent a large force under the command of Tariq Zayed, who was his chief deputy. The Arab sources disagree on the size of this force. One estimate puts it at 7,000, while another source puts it at 12,000. One thing is fairly certain: the composition of the force was primarily made up of Berbers, with Arabs comprising only a small portion. And in the previous centuries, the Arabs had conquered the Berbers, but it was a horrific fight. And so there was always sort of this tension between the Berbers and the Arabs. So Tariq landed at Gibraltar, and after capturing several towns on the coast, advanced deeper into Iberia. Roderick assembled a large Gothic army to meet Tariq. Despite being outnumbered, Tariq was able to defeat Roderick. Roderick's fate is unclear. In one account, his armor was found near a riverbank, but mysteriously no one could locate his body. The assumption is that he drowned. Another legend has him slowly devoured by snakes in punishment for his sins. The snakes kept eating him until all of his sins were purged. Ouch! In any event, regardless of how Roderick died, he was the last king of the Goths. Now, after the victory, Musa dispatched a message to the Caliph describing his great victory over the Visigoths. Since it was a decisive victory, all Spain was certain to fall into the hands of the Moors. Tariq didn't waste any time following up on his victory and pushed on without delay. Dividing his forces into 3 brigades, he spread them over the peninsula and reduced city after city after city. The defeated Visigoths retreated towards Toledo, the ancient capital of Spain. It seems Tariq was able to bypass several cities altogether and take Toledo without much of a struggle, since by the time he had arrived, the city had been abandoned by the Visigoths. The city surrendered without a fight. So for all intents and purposes, Visigothic rule in Spain came to an abrupt end. Now, Musa grew jealous of Tariq's success in Spain and decided to launch his own invasion 1 year later. In the summer of 712, with 18,000 men, he captured Carmona and Seville and joined Tariq at Toledo. The meeting between the conqueror and his superior officer was not friendly. There were mutual jealousies and arguments over war booty. What a shock. Tariq was dismissed by Musa, but eventually he had his command restored by the Caliph. So in just a few years, the Moors had overrun most of Spain. By 717, the Berber-Arab alliance had crossed the Pyrenees, and that brought them into modern-day France. But they were stopped by Charles Martel and the Franks at the Battle of Tours in 732. This was a major victory for the Franks, and certainly made the Franks a serious power to contend with in the future. The Moors eventually swept through most of the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths literally ran for their lives to the mountains in northwest Spain, an area which you can see marked right here. And we will talk about that in the next slide. The Visigothic lands in the south were quickly confiscated. At first, there was quite a bit of pillaging and slaughter, but that is typical of any invasion. Eventually, order was restored by the Arab governors. Now, this is where much of the controversy starts. Now, in one version, the Moors treated the conquered quite gently. The serfs were still allowed to cultivate the land, and in many ways found life better under the Moors. Some accounts have the Moors welcomed by both non-Christians and Christians alike. A majority of the population in Iberia very much liked these new rulers and could do business with them, even the Hebrews. Also, the Christians and Hebrews under Moorish rule were allowed to keep practicing their faith. They were even permitted to retain their own laws and customs, and had quite a degree of autonomy. Okay, so that's one version. In another version, the inhabitants in the Iberian Peninsula hated the Moors and were consistently abused and pillaged, and there was more or less always conflict and problems between these two rival factions. So how much of this is true or false? Well, in reality, it's really hard to know what the people of Iberia, at least during that time period, thought of the Moors. The problem, as I mentioned before, is that there are so few contemporary sources during this critical time period. We know far more about ancient wars than we do about the Moorish conquest of Iberia. That being said, I think it's a little bit naive to say things like, well, everyone hated the Moors, or everyone supported them. In reality, nothing is ever that simple. I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. And it's a far more complex situation than to simply classify it as everyone hates the Moors or that everyone is friendly to the Moors. In fact, there is evidence that shows Christians allied themselves with some Muslims, and vice versa. Some Muslims allied themselves with Christians. Even the legendary El Cid, who is Spain's greatest hero, allied with the Muslims. I should also point out that there were numerous disputes between the Moors themselves, and the Christians also had numerous disputes between rival kingdoms. So as I said, it's a far more complex situation than simply classifying one side against the other. If only it were that simple. Okay, so enough on that subject. Now, the Arabs referred to their new lands in the peninsula as Andalus, and the Moors made Cordoba their great intellectual and political center. So it was Cordoba that was the crown jewel for the Moors in Andalus. Now, as I mentioned, the remnants of the Visigoth armies retreated to northern Spain. Like the Romans, the Moors found this mountainous territory difficult to conquer. This ice-covered mountain range acted as a natural defense barrier and gave the remnants of several Visigoth armies time to reorganize. A Visigothic noble named Pelagius in 718 AD was elected as the leader, and so it was Pelagius who led the first rebellion against the Moors, and it was organized in the unconquered northern Asturian highlands, which you can see right here on the map. This united Christian army won a victory against the Moors at the Battle of Covadonga. This occurred likely in the summer of 722, so just about 10 years after Roderick's decisive defeat. The victory is often seen as the beginning of the Christian reconquest of Spain. In reality, though, this victory didn't really affect the overall situation for the Moors. They still were the dominant power in Spain and would be for many more centuries. But what it did mean was that the Christians were able to establish their own permanent and independent kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, and that entity became known as the Kingdom of Asturias. And so, as I said, this was the beginning of the Reconquista, which meant simply reconquer. I don't think anyone could have imagined at the time the conflict would last 800 years. You can see the Kingdom of Asturias on the map right here. Now, the Moors themselves provided a lot of assistance, at least unintentionally, to the survival of Asturias. And that was because the Moors themselves were deeply divided. There were two main factions, the Arabs and the Berbers. The Berbers were originally from North Africa, and when the Arabs first arrived there, a ferocious conflict broke out that lasted nearly 7 decades. The Berbers did not give up easily, and only after 7 decades of intense fighting did the Berbers finally submit to Islam. Even though these two factions shared a similar faith, they were culturally very different. The Berbers insisted on running their own government and saw themselves as co-rulers of Andalus rather than servants of the Arabs. The Berbers also felt the Arabs were taking most of the spoils and loot in Spain, and so they were treated rather poorly by their Arab commanders. And one thing almost all the sources agree on, it was mostly the Berbers that were involved in most of the early fighting in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, to make matters even worse, the Arab governors levied taxes on the Berbers. All of this culminated in a full-scale revolt that started in 739. This was a massive war that ended up in the Arabs retaining most of Andalus, but losing several other areas, most notably Morocco, which never again was part of the Caliphate. Another interesting event occurred in 756. An Arabic prince in Spain refused to recognize the authority of the Caliph in Damascus, and therefore became an independent emir of Cordoba. He was able to defeat many of the Caliph's supporters in Spain, and so he formed his own very large and independent emirate in the Iberian Peninsula. So as you can see, the Muslims were deeply divided in Iberia. Now let's switch back to Asturias. In 868 AD, King Alfonso III of Asturias knighted Vimara Perez as the first Count of Portugal. The region became known as Portucali and became the county of Portugal. So early on, Portugal was part of Asturias, and the nobles there were vassals to the King of Asturias. Asturias started to expand their territory further, but eventually was absorbed by a successor state, Leon. And you can see the Kingdom of Leon on this map around 910 AD. It wasn't long before divisions began to surface in Leon. In 931, the county of Castile was reunified by Count Fernan Gonzalez, who rose in rebellion against the Kingdom of Leon. Castile achieved an autonomous status, allowing the county to be inherited by Gonzalez's family instead of being subject to appointment by the King of Leon. And so Castile revolted from Leon's supremacy. This meant that Castile was in the process of moving from a county of Leon to a kingdom in its own right. No one could have known then that in a few centuries, Castile would become the most dominant kingdom in Spain. Interesting, though, that Castile started out as a small county in Leon itself. As I mentioned before, Portugal was at first a county that was part of Asturias, and later the county of Portugal was absorbed by Leon. So even though the nobles of Portugal were vassals to the King of Leon, they were culturally very different from Leon. Now in 1095, the King of Leon granted Portugal to his own daughter Dona Teresa and her husband. When her husband died, Dona Teresa ruled as regent for her son. She married a Galician noble. However, the Portuguese nobles were alarmed at the prospect of a union with Galicia. They rebelled and were led by her son Alfonso Enriquez. Alfonso defeated his mother Teresa in battle and became ruler of Portugal. Thus, in 1128, Portugal broke away and effectively became its own country. By the way, Portugal would become the first nation-state in Europe, several centuries before Spain became a single entity. By 1140, Alfonso called himself King of Portugal and asserted his country's independence. From 1179, the papacy also called him King of Portugal. Meanwhile, Alfonso set about reconquering territory from the Moors. In 1147, Alfonso captured Lisbon and several other cities. Meanwhile, trade continued to thrive in Portugal. And so Portugal not only became an independent kingdom, it is regarded as the first nation-state in European history. Now, you can also see in this map the growing power of Castile. In 1085, the King of Castile took Toledo and established direct control over the Moorish city from which he had been exacting tribute from. This was the first major step in the Reconquista by Christian forces. Leon maintained an independent status from 1157 to 1230, but it was clear by now that Castile was a major threat. Castile was pushing ever further south against the Muslims. The rivalry between both kingdoms continued until 1230, when Ferdinand III of Castile received the kingdom of Leon from his father Alfonso. The courts from Leon and Castile merged and formed the strongest kingdom in Spain, an event considered as the foundation of the crown of Castile. So it merged the kingdoms of Castile, Leon, and several other domains. The new coat of arms had Castile represented by a castle and Leon represented by a lion. With his powerful kingdom, King Ferdinand III captured Cordoba in 1236. The loss of Cordoba was a massive blow to the Moors in Spain. But King Ferdinand III wasn't finished. He laid siege and eventually captured Seville in 1248. The fall of Seville was yet another tremendous blow for the Muslims in Spain. The capture of Seville also saw Castile extend its reach all the way to the Mediterranean coast. Ferdinand III was one of the most successful kings of Castile, securing not only the permanent union of the crowns of Castile and Leon, but launching the largest campaign of the Reconquista yet. And by 1400, Castile had completely pushed the Moors out of Spain, except for the Kingdom of Granada. The Muslims in Granada were completely surrounded. Still, Granada would hold out for another 2.5 centuries. The reason for this was the Castilians were content to ignore the Moors in Granada for a while. Granada was forced to pay a tribute to Castile, and that probably simmered the situation down, at least for a while. Now it was time for one more great merge. The unification of Aragon and Castile came through a great marriage of their sovereigns, and this set in motion the basis for modern Spain, and in a larger sense, the Spanish Empire. And this was the marriage in 469 between the Queen of Castile, Isabella, and the King of Aragon, Ferdinand. The union of Aragon and Castile by marriage was really the death knell of Granada. Isabella and Ferdinand decided to conquer Granada, and since Granada was essentially surrounded on all sides, it was only a matter of time. The war with Granada began in 1482, but it would take another 10 years to finish Granada off. That same year, Columbus made his voyage to the New World. Interestingly, when Columbus made his first landing, he carried the flag of Castile. It wasn't until 1516 that both territories were unified under a single king, and that was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V.